In this section, I'm going to start talking about how to use a Ansible module with Arista's EOS switches. So we have this Cisco IOS example that is similar to what we had seen in a previous class. So if we look at it, we have a simple playbook. It's only doing iOS facts at this point, and we can execute this against the two Cisco devices. So if we go ahead and start modifying this to work with Arista, so let's copy iOS example to EOS example. Go ahead and edit this file. We'll change this, and let's start with just using a single Arista switch. Once again, these are all defined in my Ansible hosts, so in my inventory file. And at this point, I'm just going to use pinet-sw1. Go in here. Now, one thing we need to think about here with Arista is Arista does support both an eAPI connection and also an SSH connection. So first of all, let's start out with trying to just do the SSH connection. And this means we're going to need to add this transport colon CLI argument. So we're adding to our credentials, telling it to use SSH. And I'm actually going to change this to be SSH for the name of the variable. And down here, I'll go ahead and say the provider is the SSH provider. Now this is no longer going to be iOS facts, it's going to be EOS facts. And up at the top, let's go ahead and change this to be EOS example. Now let's go ahead and try to execute this and see what happens. Go ahead and execute our playbook. It's gathering EOS facts. And these Arista switches that I have are a little bit slow in my virtual environment, so they do take a little bit of time to execute. Okay, so that actually executed correctly, went and ran. Let's go ahead and execute it again, but this time let's do a little bit more verbose so we can see the output and we can see whether in fact it did grab Ansible facts or not. And while that's executing, I'm going to go ahead and get this other shell ready. So go into this sandbox, go into week 2. Okay. Then you can see if we look above, you can see we are getting some Ansible facts. Scroll up a little bit more. We can see Ansible net all the IPv4 addresses, the file systems, the name of the switch, etc. Okay, so now we have this working with SSH. Let's try to set this up to work with eAPI. So I'm going to make another variable. I'm going to name it eAPI. I'm going to name the transport to be eAPI. So that's the value we need to use for the transport. And if I go and I search on EOS facts, and make this bigger. Scroll down. I know I need to use something that says, okay, when you're using eAPI, it's going to use SSL by default, but we need to say validate certs no. So we'll add one other argument, which is validate cert. And then I'm going to change this, not that, this one, to be eAPI. So now we have, here's a connection if we use SSH, here's a connection if we use the API, and let's see if this now works as well. And now that's running, and while that's running, I'm going to go ahead and go here and just actually start creating a copy. I won't save this at this point until that other one's finished, but I actually want one that executes and just uses SSH, and I want a second fact gathering that uses EAPI because I want to verify that both of them are working correctly. Okay, so now we see that we connected via EAPI properly, and let me just see if we can see those connections any longer. So here you can actually see it was connecting on port 443, it was using SSL, connected to some of the remote devices, this PiNet switch 1 in this case. Okay, so now if we go back to this window, we have an SSH connection, we have an API connection. Now, let's expand this to not be a single Arista switch, but the entire Arista group. And now I know from past experiences, a problem I run into in my lab environment, that my lab environment is slow, so I need to increase this SSH timeout, so I'm going to increase that to 60 seconds. Now, let's go ahead and execute this and see, can we fact gather on all 4 of the Arista switches? So here we're doing the SSH fact gathering. And then here in a minute, it's going to do the EAPI fact gathering. And while we're waiting for that to complete, I'm actually going to go back in here and add a name argument here. This is just a string that gets printed out when it executes. So I'm going to say SSH fact gathering. Need to get rid of my hyphen there. Then I'm going to say here EAPI fact gathering. Okay, now we go back to our execution. We see that we gathered facts using SSH. We gathered facts using the API. It worked for all 4 of the Arista switches in both those 2 cases. Now, let's expand this and try to use the EOS _ command module and try to execute something like show ARP and see if that works properly. So here we're going to use the EOS _ command module. Well, once again, we'll use EAPI to accomplish this. And now we need one additional argument, which is commands that we're going to run. And we're going to try to run show ARP. And just to expedite this, I'm going to add a tag so we can run only the show command. Go ahead and save that. And run the show cmd. Here we're executing our show command. We get some warnings back. I think this is actually sort of a documentation error on Arista's part. I've just flagged them about it. And then we'll go ahead and look here. So these warnings above, I think this is actually largely a bug on their part. They're setting certain things to default values in a certain context, and they're warning us about those default values, even though we're using a provider which is not going to be deprecated anytime soon, so it shouldn't be flagging these to us. Now you can see we retrieved the ARP table and got these ARP entries back. Once again, just like we had seen with Cisco IOS, we could start processing this data that we retrieved back and start trying to grab something from inside this returned data structure. So if we look back at our playbook, a few takeaways to remember. So we're inside our Ansible playbook, i.e. we're writing an Ansible script. This is being written in YAML. We have one play. The one play is going to execute on the 4 Arista switches, i.e. all the members of the Arista group in our inventory. Here we defined 2 variables, one for SSH use, one for eAPI use. eAPI is going to default to using a transport of SSL, so it's going to use HTTPS and port 443. I just have self-signed certificates, so I say validate certs no. In general, I like to test first with the EOS fax and get that working, and then I move on to EOS command. Here we have our tasks section. We have 3 tasks in our task section. Here's the EOS fax that's using SSH. Here's the EOS fax that's using eAPI. And then we execute a show ARP command using eAPI. If we wanted to save the output of this, we could use the register keyword, save this into a variable, and then we could add another task like the following, call the debug task, print out the register output, and have that be printed to the screen.